Okay, let's unpack this. We're taking a deep dive today into the 2024 annual report from Vestas, a global leader in the wind energy industry.
Yeah.
Think of this report not just as, dry numbers, but more like a roadmap. It shows how a huge company like Vestas navigates the really complex world of renewable energy right now.
From finance to operations, sustainability goals, risks, the whole picture.
Exactly. And our mission here is to pull out the most important nuggets of insight, the things that really tell the story of their year.
And give you a clearer view of where this critical industry might be heading without you needing to wade through hundreds of pages.
Okay, so where do we start? What's the big picture from 2024?
Well, what immediately jumps out from the report is the market context itself. They point out that the main drivers for wind energy development actually shifted quite significantly last year.
Oh, how so?
While climate goals are still, fundamentally important, they became maybe more of a peripheral driver in day-to-day investment decisions
Compared to what then?
compared to the immediate pressures of energy security and cost of living concerns. Those became much more central.
Ah, okay. That shift must have created some headwinds for the industry then, I imagine.
Definitely. The report mentions this directly. It led to delays or even, withdrawals of some projects,
Which kind of projects?
particularly those enabling technologies that often go hand in hand with wind, like PTX and Power to X.
Right, using renewable electricity to make green fuels or chemicals.
Exactly. And also energy storage projects. Those felt the pinch.
So the nice-to-haves, or maybe the future-focused stuff, got pushed back a bit.
Kind of. Those projects, while crucial long-term, definitely seem to suffer when developers tighten their belts or reprioritized based on those immediate market signals.
But it wasn't all bad news, presumably.
No, not at all. The report balances this. It highlights the continued strong focus on expanding energy capacity in many key countries. Think the USA, Germany, Australia, the UK. And importantly, the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, continued to have really positive impacts. It kept stimulating investment.
Right, the IRA has been a big factor, so it sounds like the industry really had to adapt quickly to these changing priorities.
Yeah. And the report uses some pretty direct language about this. Suggests the industry needs to mature.
Mature? How?
Well, they say developers and OEMs like Vestas themselves should let what cannot stand fall.
Wow, that's a strong statement. What does that maturity actually look like in practice?
I think it suggests a move away from maybe projects or business models that aren't fundamentally robust enough for this new, more volatile market.
So getting leaner, more focused.
Yeah, efficiency, resilience, perhaps focusing on the core business strengths that can actually weather these shifts. For Vestas, that means there are four main areas.
Which are?
Onshore wind, offshore wind, development, that's where they actually initiate projects themselves, and of course service, maintaining the turbines.
Got it. And looking ahead, despite those 2024 challenges, the report does cite some pretty robust growth expectations towards 2030, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, they see offshore market value increasing by like 20–25% annually. That's huge.
20 to 25%. Okay, and onshore.
Onshore new installations, they see growing 7–9% annually. And the service market value growing 8–10% annually.
So that outlook suggests the underlying long-term trajectory for wind is still pretty strong, even with these shifting priorities year to year.
Absolutely. It paints a picture of, let's say, short-term adaptation within a much longer-term growth story.
Okay, so let's turn to the numbers then. You said they tell a story. How did Vestas actually perform financially in 2024?
Well, revenue climbed to EUR 17.3 billion. That's a decent increase from EUR 15.4 billion in 2023.
That's solid top-line growth. And what about the bottom line? Profitability.
That looked much better, too. Their EBIT margin, that's earnings before interest and taxes, basically operating profit margin.
Right.
Before special items, it improved quite dramatically, jumped to 4.3% from a much lower 1.5% in 2023.
Okay, 1.5 up to 4.3. That is a significant improvement. What does that indicate?
It indicates better operational efficiency, better profitability per sale compared to the previous year. Things are moving in the right direction.
And looking forward, orders.
Their combined order backlog hit a record high, EUR 68.4 billion by the end of 2024.
A record backlog. That provides a really strong foundation, doesn't it? Visibility for future revenue.
Exactly. So financially, there's definitely an upward trend visible in these headline numbers.
Interesting. How did the individual business segments do? The report notes the service business actually had a disappointing year in 2024. That seems a bit counterintuitive for what you'd think is a stable maintenance business.
It does seem that way. And they attribute it mainly to cost challenges, things like higher unit costs for parts, some operational inefficiencies, and also dealing with some quality issues.
Hmm.
However, even with that disappointment, service remains highly profitable. And crucially, it was a real stabilizing factor for the company during periods when their power solutions segment.
That's the turbo manufacturing and project side.
Yeah, exactly. When that side faced tougher times in the past,
Hmm.
service kept things steady. And they say they've initiated a recovery plan to tackle those service challenges now.
Okay. And how did Power Solutions itself do in 2024?
That segment saw an increase in revenue. It was driven by higher average sales prices for their turbines. They were getting more per turbine sold, and also improved project execution.
So better margins there.
Well, they highlight a particularly strong EBIT margin of 12.9% just in the fourth quarter.
12.9% in Q4. Okay. That suggests some positive momentum building towards the end of the year.
Definitely looks that way.
And the development business, the part where they initiate projects.
That seems to have punched above its weight too, contributed significantly to earnings, and brought new projects to the table, like a big 270 milliW project in the USA that reached maturity.
So it underscores that their value isn't just in building turbines, but also in originating viable wind farm projects.
Yes, exactly. It's part of their integrated approach. Overall, the company ended 2024 in a strong financial position. They've got a big liquidity reserve, EUR 5,510 million,
Okay.
and they maintained their BA2 credit rating with a stable outlook from Moody's.
Bought too. That's investment grade, right? Signals they're seen as pretty solid financially.
It does. It means credit rating agencies view their ability to meet financial obligations as, yeah, solid.
And they also report on something called EU taxonomy alignment. For listeners who might not be deep into sustainable finance reporting, what is that exactly?
Right. The E taxonomy is basically a classification system. It's
Yeah.
designed to identify economic activities that are environmentally sustainable according to a pretty rigorous set of criteria.
Okay, a green checklist, essentially. How did Vestas do?
They reported extremely high percentages for 2024, 99% aligned revenue.
99%.
Yeah. 92% aligned OPEX, that's their operating expenses, day-to-day costs,
Yeah.
and 99% aligned their capital expenses, investments, and assets.
Wow, those numbers are exceptionally high. What does that actually mean in simple terms?
It essentially means that almost their entire core business, how they earn money, how they spend day-to-day, and how they invest for the future, is classified as environmentally sustainable, according to this EU framework.
That's a very strong statement about the nature of their business.
It really is. It reflects that their core activity is renewable energy.
Okay, so moving beyond the pure financials, this is where I think it gets really interesting. How they view their broader impact and risks through a sustainability lens. The report emphasizes something called a double materiality assessment.
Ah, yes, double materiality. That's key.
Explain that. What does double mean here?
It means they don't just look at the impact the company has on the world, things like their emissions or land use. That's the traditional view.
Right.
But critically, double materiality also looks at the significant impacts the world has on the company.
Ah, the other way around. Like what?
Things like the physical risks of climate change affecting their operations, or social instability, or regulatory shifts suddenly changing the rules of the game. It's a two-way street.
Okay, that makes sense. Impact on the world and impact from the world on the business. And based on that assessment.
They identified several key material topics,
Mhm.
the things that matter most to their business and their stakeholders.
Such as?
Climate change, obviously. Circularity, dealing with waste and resources. Biodiversity, human rights, health and safety, transparent tax, cybersecurity, and land use. Quite a list.
Okay, let's dig into a few of those. Climate change first. Their core strategy includes a pretty ambitious goal, right? Carbon neutral in their own operations.
Yeah, Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, so their direct emissions and those from purchased energy, they want those to be carbon neutral by 2030.
And notably, without using carbon offsets, I think.
That's right. No offsets for their own operations goal by 2030, which is, a bold near-term target for their direct footprint.
But there's always a but with emissions, isn't there?
There is. And the report is very transparent about the much, much larger challenge. 98.8% of their total emissions originate in their value chain.
Wow, 98.8%. So that's scope 3, supply chain, transport, using the turbines.
Exactly. It puts the scale of that Scope 3 challenge into perspective, doesn't it? Their own direct emissions are frankly, tiny compared to the emissions generated by producing all the materials that go into their turbines or shipping them around the world.
That's staggering. So tackling Scope 3 is the real mountain to climb.
Precisely. And the report drills down further. The biggest single Scope 3 challenge comes from materials, particularly steel and iron.
Makes sense. Turbines are mostly steel.
They make up 80 to 90% of a turbine's physical mass, and they're responsible for about half, 50% of Vestas' total Scope 3 emissions.
Half their Scope 3 just from steel and iron. Tackling emissions in those complex global supply chains must be incredibly difficult compared to just switching to renewable electricity in your own factories.
Oh, vastly harder. But they give a fascinating specific example of how they're trying to tackle this materials challenge. They're partnering for low-emission steel production.
Low-emission steel, how does that work?
By using processes that rely more on scrap steel and are powered by renewable energy, like wind energy itself. They say this can reduce the embedded emissions in that steel by up to 66% compared to traditional methods.
66% reduction, that's significant.
It is. And they actually launched low-emission steel towers as a new product offering in 2024. So it's becoming a commercial reality.
That's a really concrete step towards decarbonizing the core components. What about their own Scope 1 and 2 again? You said no offsets, so how are they reducing them?
Well, the main things are sourcing 100% renewable electricity for their facilities, switching heating systems away from fossil fuels, and increasing the number of electric or hybrid vehicles in their service fleet.
Right, the more direct control stuff. Okay, let's shift gears. Circularity and resource use. Their long-term vision here is pretty bold, too. Zero waste wind turbines by 2040.
Yeah, zero waste by 2040, that's a big one. A major hurdle for circularity in wind has always been recycling those massive, complex turbine blades.
Right, the composite materials, the epoxy.
Exactly, they're hard to deal with. But the report highlights the development of a new circular recycling method they've pioneered with partners.
Oh, what's new about it?
This method can actually separate and recover the raw materials, the glass fiber, and the epoxy resin from those blades.
Ah, so not just downcycling into park benches, but getting the original materials back?
Potentially, yeah, which significantly improves the recyclability and also makes projects more competitive where circularity criteria are becoming important in tenders, for example.
Interesting. And they still use traditional recycling routes, too.
Oh, yes. Especially when they repower older wind farms, taking down old turbines and putting up new ones. The old materials get recycled through established channels, too.
And their overall waste recycling rate for 2024?
The report says 68.2% of their waste was recycled.
Okay, 68.2%. So room for improvement, but the focus seems to be on cracking those really tough components like blades.
Definitely. And this ties into another point they highlight, the growing opportunity for repowering.
Replacing old turbines with new ones on existing sites?
Exactly. Apparently, around 15% of the global onshore wind fleet is now over 20 years old. These are the first-generation turbines reaching the end of their design life.
So a big replacement market is opening up.
It seems so. The report expects this repowering market to reach around 6 GW annually outside China by 2030, mainly in mature markets like the USA, Germany, Spain.
And Vestas is playing in that space.
Yeah, they received 900 milliW worth of repowering orders in 2024, so they're already active in capturing that opportunity.
Okay. What about biodiversity and ecosystems? The report states their direct impact is relatively low compared to some other industries, like mining or forestry.
Right, but they still identify it as a material topic.
Why is that, if the impact is low?
Well, the material impacts link back to things we've already discussed. The GHG emissions from producing materials, which affects ecosystems globally, and also localized land use change, where the turbines are actually sited.
And there are risks for the business, too.
Yes, they highlight what they call transitional risk. Basically, if you ignore biodiversity concerns during project development, you could face significant financial costs later on. For example, being forced into operational curtailment, having to stop turbines from spinning during peak bird migration season or when bats are active. That directly hits revenue.
Okay. So managing biodiversity isn't just about being green, it's also about managing financial risk.
Absolutely. But it's not all negative impacts, right? They do mention the artificial reef effect.
Yeah, from offshore turbine foundations.
Exactly. Those underwater structures can actually create new marine habitats, attracting fish and other species.
So how do they manage the biodiversity impacts overall?
Their approach focuses mainly on minimizing negative impacts up front. Careful site selection is key, avoiding sensitive areas like known migratory corridors.
Makes sense. Avoid the problem in the first place.
Right. and then using operational curtailment when needed, based on monitoring bird and bat activity. Plus, standard environmental impact assessments, EIAs.
And crucially,
They explicitly state they do not use biodiversity offsets.
no offsets. Why is that significant?
Well, it implies a focus on avoiding and mitigating impacts directly at the source, where the wind farm is, rather than compensating for unavoidable damage in one area by funding conservation somewhere else, which can be controversial.
Interesting distinction. Okay, let's touch on the social aspects, people and communities. How do they approach that?
They broke it down. First, there's their own workforce. The goal is being the safest, most inclusive, socially responsible company they can be. Safety culture is a huge priority.
How do they track that?
It's reported quarterly right up to the board, based on global standards like ISO 45001.
And they talk about equity over equality.
Yes, which I found interesting. Given their incredibly diverse global workforce, they emphasize equity, recognizing that different people from different backgrounds might need different kinds of support to thrive, rather than just treating everyone exactly the same.
That's a nuanced point. What about diversity targets?
They're tracking them. For instance, they reached 28% women in top management by the end of 2024, which actually exceeded their 2025 target of 25%.
Okay, progress there. And employee feedback.
Standard stuff, really. Employee engagement surveys, and they have an ethics line for raising concerns confidentially.
What about beyond their own employees? Workers in the value chain, suppliers.
Right. Here, the focus is on ensuring human rights and fair labor practices throughout their incredibly complex global supply network.
Where do they police that?
Through their supplier code of conduct, which sets expectations, and then active due diligence processes. That includes doing on-site audits for their direct suppliers, which is pretty essential when your supply chain spans the globe.
Yeah, you have to check. And finally, affected communities, people living near the wind farms.
Here, they stress the importance of engaging early in the project development process. Public consultations, local meetings.
Trying to get ahead of potential issues.
Exactly. To understand, prevent, and mitigate potential adverse impacts, especially things like land use change risks. They even apply a specific social due diligence, or SDD, process.
When do they use that?
For projects in emerging markets, which might have weaker local regulations, or for any project in OECD countries where there might be risks related to indigenous peoples' lands. It recognizes the need for extra care and attention in those specific contexts.
Got it. Okay, moving towards governance and risks. The report mentions their board composition.
Yeah, they highlight its diversity. 60% female members, different nationalities represented, and a mix of shorter and longer tenures on the board.
Which is generally seen as good practice for robust decision-making, right? Having different perspective.
It is. And linking back to that double materiality concept we discussed, the report also details key risks facing the company.
Okay, what are the big ones?
Well, cybersecurity is identified as a financially material risk.
Why cyber? Because turbines are connected.
Exactly. Modern turbines are basically highly connected technology assets. And disruptions, which could potentially come from politically motivated actors, could impact energy production itself. That's critical infrastructure.
Right. So what are they doing about it?
They're responding by investing heavily in cyber risk management. They launched a dedicated strategy in 2024 and are even piloting a specific cybersecurity service framework for their customers, offering protection as a service.
Okay, that makes sense. What other risks?
They also flag transition risks, like the potential for carbon taxes, increasing the cost of those CO2-intensive materials we talked about, like steel.
So if the cost of steel goes up due to carbon pricing,
and they can't pass those increased costs fully onto their customers, it directly impacts their profitability. That's a classic transition risk.
Gotcha. Anything else major?
Other usual suspects for a global industrial company. Cost overruns, which can happen due to supply chain volatility or maybe lack of standardization in project requirements sometimes. And the ever-present risk of corruption and bribery, just given their global footprint.
How do they manage the corruption risk?
Through extensive compliance programs, training, codes of conduct. It's worth noting they reported 0 convictions or fines for corruption or bribery in 2024.
That's a positive indicator, yeah. Shows the compliance efforts are likely working.
Seems so. And of course, there are the land-related impacts we touched on earlier, potential displacement or land use restrictions from building out wind farms. That's always a risk to manage carefully.
And how do they engage politically? What's their stance there?
Their approach, as detailed in the report, seems focused purely on accelerating the energy transition itself. They advocate for policies that support faster build-out, streamline the often slow permitting processes, enhance grid capacity, which is a huge bottleneck, and improve the design of renewable energy auctions. They report making indirect political contributions, funding think tanks, industry associations, that kind of thing, totaling EUR 4.6 million in 2024,
Yeah.
all aimed at fostering that enabling policy environment.
Okay. And finally, tax.
They highlight their transparency on tax matters. They even publish a specific tax sustainability report and talk about using technology to streamline compliance, trying to be seen as a responsible taxpayer globally.
Right. So all these pieces, governance, risk management, policy engagement, transparency, they're all vital components, aren't they, for operating such a complex global business in a sector like renewables that's changing so fast.
Absolutely. It's not just about the technology, it's about managing the whole ecosystem around it.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you listening? This deep dive into Vestas 2024 report really shows a company navigating a really dynamic and sometimes pretty challenging global energy landscape.
Definitely dynamic.
They're dealing with those shifting market drivers we talked about, security, cost of living, taking center stage sometimes. They're managing significant risks across their operations, like cyber threats and supply chain costs.
But they're also reporting financial improvements. That's strengthening EBIT margin, that record backlog.
Right. And at the same time, pushing forward these really ambitious, quite detailed goals for sustainability, for circularity, like zero-waste turbines, and for social responsibility across their vast value chain.
Yeah, it really hammers home that the energy transition isn't just about, installing more turbines.
No, it's deeply intertwined with global finance, national policy, managing incredibly complex global operations.
And addressing these profound environmental and social impacts, both the ones they cause and the ones that affect them. It's a whole system transformation, as you said.
Exactly. So here's a final provocative thought for you to chew on, building on all this. Given the report mentions politicians need that long-term view, and the industry itself needs to, quote, let what cannot stand fall. How might that increasing focus we saw in 2024 on immediate energy security and immediate cost of living concerns actually reshape which types of wind energy projects or which specific technologies, maybe like those PTX and storage projects that saw delays, or even which policy frameworks are the ones most likely to thrive and actually stand in the coming years? Which ones will prove robust enough?